Hi, in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to use Apache's HTTP client to build a GET request and a POST request onto a existing web service. We're going to use HTTP client, as I mentioned, to send and receive the data, and we're going to use Jackson to parse the JSON into a newest string. So let's take a look at the service I have running. I'm running on my local host and it's called students, and when I send it I get a variety of authors. This is parameterized as well. If I add in a student ID of 7 here, I just get Heinrich Heyer. 42 gives me Douglas Adams. And not using it gets me all. It's not a very robust or complicated service, but it certainly works. Now what's important is you see the response back as JSON, you see the JSON variables. So you need to use these to create a class. Alright, so I'm going to start by building myself a class. I'm going to call it student.java. And you're going to create a class variable for each one of the JSON objects and make your life simple. Make sure it matches. So we see I've got student ID, fname, lname, lname. And since I'm going to eventually end up using Jackson, you need all the setters and getters, etc. I've got to generate everything object here in Visual Studio Code, and all I have to do is import Java util. My toString isn't real pretty, it just wraps it in curly braces, but it works. Okay, so I have myself my student class, which I'm going to need. Now I need to set up my POM. I need to add in the HTTP client. I didn't find it. Here it comes. Just make sure you get the one from Apache. And then I need all my Jackson stuff. So we need Jackson data bind, Jackson core, and Jackson annotations. And I'm pulling them all from com.FasterXML. I don't like this bundle. It never seems to work for me. I can also never find Oh, it worked this time. Jackson annotations never pops up for me. It's a good day. And one more. Jackson data binds. Also from FasterXML. Alright, so that's the only thing you need for your POM. I'm going to save it. I'm going to say always, and this updates. Once this downloads, as you know, all the jar files you need. So now we have everything we need from a setup point of view to get this working. We have our class built. Let's create a simple get. This program is not going to do anything except for demonstrate how HTTP client works. So I'm going to do a variety of things using methods just so I can block them off. You could take this logic and put this into a real application, such as a Android app or a Java GUI, just by copying my code out and putting it where you need it. Okay, I'll start by creating an object. I'm going to create a final static. It's going to be called closable HTTP client. This is the HTTP client is preferred. It will support async or synchronous connections. Okay, so this is, why is it not there? Great default, thank you. So you're going to use this throughout your entire project. Why I put it up at the top. It's kind of heavy to create, so it makes sense to do it once. HTTP client throws several exceptions. I'm simply going to ignore them which is not the best coding practice, but it works here for our simplicity. So I'm simply going to say that each one of these functions throws an exception. I'll tell main. If I could spell. All right, so simple get is simply going to get the data from the service. My service is running, as we saw in Postman. So what you start with is you build a request. I like to call mine request. And you put in the URL. Spring Boot, which is what I'm using to run my service, defaults to 8080. I need to do some importing here. And this is, of course, HttpClient methods. This opens the connection. I haven't used it yet, which is why it's yelling at me. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to execute this. I'm going to use the closable HttpClient. I'm going to get a response. This is what comes back from the service. I'm going to use my HttpClient from up above. I'm going to execute. And you see there's a variety of arguments here. I can send in parameters. I can send in different response handlers. I'm going to just use the basic request. Response will hold the JSON that comes back. Why are you angry at me? Okay, what did I do? Closable HTTP. It's just response. That's what happens whenever you let your IDE help you too much. You make stupid errors. And I need to import this. Alright, so now response will hold the JSON that comes back. It will also hold any status codes. I'm going to simply dump the JSON to the screen and prove it works, and then I'm going to parse it. I'm using a tool from Apache HttpClient called Entity Utils, and the entity is the stuff we get back or the stuff we send. So I'm going to pass in here entity. Response. No, I'm going to pass it entity. I missed the line. Do that line above this. I need to convert and get my response. Fix my import. Okay, so if I've done everything correctly, excuse me, this should dump out my JSON. Well, I need to call it first. Simple gets. Run that Java. Okay, so I got an error message 404 not found. It says path not found because it's correct. It's students. So you see what happens when you screw up. Try it again. There we go. I got my JSON back. It's not pretty, but it's JSON. Okay, so now I'm going to parse it and do something with it. So I'm going to comment out my line, and I'm simply going to use Jackson now to map it over. You are able here to check status lines. So if you want to check to see if you got an OK, you can check that by checking response. If I get status line, get status code. So you can do one of these things. So give us some type of error. You really should, as a developer, check your status codes come back off of services. Even if you've written the service, you don't want to assume they work. So if it's not equal to 200, I'm going to kick out. So I could display the status code here. And I'm going to show you what that does. See, I get my 404 error. Not found. When I have it right, it runs, of course, which will do nothing at this point because I don't have any outputs. Good. Okay, so check your status returns. If you've written your service, you should know what the status returns are. If you have not, 200 is always okay. If you're not sure of anything else, just check for 200. Okay, so now I'm going to use Jackson to convert this over. Import the object map from Jackson. Okay, so what you have to do now is we have to convert the entity we have up here into a string entity. And then we have to walk through it. All right, so we're going to build a list. It does not have to be a list. I just like lists. I need import Java util. I'm going to do accounts. It's always nice to know how many we get back. And now I'm going to read the list. Read value throws a bunch of errors. What we'll do here is we'll give it the source and the type. So I'm going to use entity utils again. So I'm converting entity over into an entity util string. And the data type I'm going to pull out of here is going to be a type student. I'm going to use the old school way of type reference. And here I'll cast it. And since this is blank, I'll just make this all in one line. All right, so at this point, stud list should have a list of students. I'm going to count it. And print outs. So quick run, see if that works. Should get 4. Yep, 4 students found. Awesome. So let's now print it out. I'm going to use the for each loop. So I'm going to populate student through student list for each student in the student list. Now, normally you would do something better with this and just dump the screen. But I'm simply done with the screen. I don't know what you're supposed to do. This is where logic would go for parsing the data you get off your web service. Boom, there we go. And that's what my toString does. That's the default toString. It's not pretty, but it works. All right, so that's a simple get. Let's build one for a parameterized version. Now, there's not a lot of change here. It's the third time that I misspelled exception. All right, so the code is identical to what we have up here. So I'm going to copy everything out of get. I'm going to make one really simple change. I'm going to change this HTTP. I could have done this as one function with a parameter, but I chose not to, just so you can differentiate them. So all I have to do is simply modify the string. So I'm going to need this. I'm going to replace it with the URL. I'm going to use string.format. And as we saw in Postman, when I use this parameter, I get question mark stud ID equals something. So that 42 is going to be replaced with the placeholder %e. I'm going to pass in my stud ID. That's it. So let's comment out simple get in main. Let's call it parameterized get. Let's pass in 42 so we get Douglas Adams back. Run this. Boom, one student found Douglas Adams. If I do something that's not in there, connection's bad, 404. I could respond to that better than connection is bad, but you see that it picks it up if it doesn't find it. Okay, last thing we're going to do is we're going to post a JSON document to the service. Okay, so I'm going to recall simple get here in a minute. I'm going to call this post guy up above it. Okay, so there's really not a lot of difference here between getting and posting. You start though with a different object. Instead of HTTP get, we use HTTP post. And that's not surprising. I think it's still in there. No, it's not in there. Okay. So I'll screw this up. Let's go copy it. Import this, of course. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an object. I'm going to use Jackson to convert this over to JSON, and then I'm going to send the JSON up because my service depends upon receiving JSON, not individual parameters. You could just manually build the JSON in code. For 3 variables is not that bad. However, as life gets real and you have 500s key JSON file, you don't want to do that by hand. Okay, so I'll use object mapper here. And again, these guys throw exception because I'll just continue with my tend of just throw exception. 4 times. Okay, so what we have to do is we have to convert my student into what's called a string entity. String entity is an HTTP client object. It is a string, but it has a content type attached to it. And you see that comes from org Apache. So what it wants is it wants the string, And I'll use mapper to convert this thing over. And I'll use the content type of application JSON. You see a variety of different types here. We're using JSON. Press enter so we can read this. Why are you yelling at me? I thought I did that. Okay, so string entity converts my JSON object into a string entity, so it'll have the JSON string inside of it, and it'll let it know it's JSON. I'm going to set this and send it. So I'm putting JSON in my body. This will be using the RequestBody element that's my service requests. I now create a closable HTTP response to get the response, and I check to make sure that it works. You see that this is the same code we put up above. And now again, I'm going to check my return. My service, of course, returns 200 if it works. Returns, I think, 501 if it's bad. And I'll again display the status code. As a developer, you, of course, probably handle each error return differently. So what should happen when I call my post to students, James Corey should be added to the list, and simple get will show that. Let's see if it works. There he is, James Corey. By the way, James Corey is multiple people. If you're not sure who James Corey is, they write the Expanse series of books and TV shows, which are excellent science fiction if you're into that. They're mentored by some guy named George R.R. Martin. You might have heard of him too. But let's see what happens when I try to add him again, or add them again, excuse me. See? Student not added. Because he's already there. 406 is return I send back. Not acceptable. Alright, so in this video you learned how to use HTTP clients to use GET and POST requests. Put and delete are very similar. Again, it's HTTP put instead of HTTP post, so you could figure that out. Alright, thanks for playing along. Good luck.